Let's begin today's sermon with a moment of prayer. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, our rock and redeemer. Amen. The title of today's sermon is History Doesn't Repeat, but It Rhymes. In hearing the story and reading the story a lot of these two disciples on the road to Emmaus, I found myself identifying a lot with them. They're on a journey just like we are right now. They're not quite sure what's going on or what's going to come next. There's just a lot of momentous things that are going on, and they're trying to figure it all out. Now, in the story, it never really says why they are going to Emmaus. Um, what's so important? Shouldn't they be staying with the apostles and grieving the loss of Jesus? There have been different speculations on exactly what had them on the road. Some thought they were returning to their homes or going to some place that's safe because they didn't believe that Jerusalem was a safe place for Jesus's disciples. It could be that it was a necessary trip that couldn't be avoided. Um, but regardless of why they're on the road, an important thing to recognize is that even though they're on the road on this still Easter morning for them, they have all of the essential facts, but they're not able to put it together yet. They don't really know what's going on with the passion of Jesus and where things are left. They are so confused, in fact, that they encounter Jesus on the road and they don't recognize him. As it says in the scriptures, they were prevented from recognizing him. And again, our imagination can kind of run wild as to why that's not the case. When I was a kid, I would think that it was God's magical choice to make that happen. But it's equally as possible that they could have just been so overwhelmed by grief, so convinced that they were not going to see Jesus again, or distracted by their thoughts that they never really put it together that this was the person to whom they've been seeking. But they encounter this person whom they don't know, but Jesus knows them, and they don't seem to know what's going on. And so the disciples feel they have to catch them up on the stories of the times. And so they share, don't you know what's going on in Jerusalem? And then they talk about Jesus and say, they crucified him. We had hoped he was the one who would redeem Israel. And from that line, it sounds like they've given up that hope. But going on further, they tell the story of how some of the women from their group had gone to the tomb that morning and found it empty. The women had come to us saying that they'd even seen a vision of angels who told them that he is alive. And so there's just a lot of confusion and speculation. But though they think they're catching Jesus up on current affairs, quickly it turns around and he is catching them up. As he says, you foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about. And so then Jesus begins to do what he has done so many times before. He starts to teach them again. He is teaching the scriptures and reinterpreting the scriptures, starting with the story of Moses and working through the prophets. Now, again, this is information they've had before, but they didn't know how to put it together. And so, in hearing this going on in the story, it reminded me of the quote that was often attributed to Mark Twain that says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And that, in some ways, is what Jesus is doing, is showing them the rhythmic similarities between what was going on in the time of the Hebrew scriptures and what was going on in their current present time with Jesus's passion, arrest, death, and now resurrection. And this is also why we so often gather together, is that we too are looking for these same echoes or rhymes in the stories that we've been raised on and the challenges in our lives. We've heard this story of the disciples on the road to Emmaus before, but we are still hearing new ways in which this story rhymes with today or brings things to the fore that we may not have realized before. And oftentimes, this is one of the values of our history, is helping us remember what are the truths that we need to hold on to over time. This is a true conservative value. We are conserving the things, the treasures of the past, and keeping them with us as we go forward. Now, I don't use the word conservative in a purely political sense, but more in a philosophical sense, but it still kind of applies that we try to conserve what's worth keeping. We try not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there are many things that I think that we so often get so confused by what we've interpreted conservative versus progressive to mean now that we lose track of the fact that we truly do need both of these trends in our lives. And they don't often line up with current political ideologues. For example, environmentalism is truly a conservative ideal. It's even called conservationism. It's the idea that we're trying to preserve the good of nature that we've inherited. It reminds me of a story of a town in Kansas called Greenberg. In 2007, they were flattened by an F5 tornado that went downtown and basically destroyed every building it came across. The town leaders decided that they were going to rebuild the town as a green town, stating that taking care of the earth and taking care of the land is a traditional value that they had been taught generation after generation as farmers. And so, in this same way, Jesus is conservative. He's reminding Judean leaders what God had promised and what God had called them to do. Now, you can also look at it that Jesus was progressive, that he did not just accept that the way things were right now is the way that things always had to be. In truth, he was doing what we hope we all can do, mining the past for the treasures we don't want to lose and using them to build the future. And so, again, we can't help to see these parallels or rhymes of history. But the challenge, of course, is to make sense of it all, knowing what the difference is between the nuggets of wisdom that we need to cherish and the sweet tasting and empty nostalgia. And as Jesus chided the disciples on that road, he said, "You foolish people, your dull minds keep you from believing all that the prophets talked about." And so instead of us arguing over whether Jesus is conservative or progressive or on this side or on that side, we need to remind ourselves that we are called to be on Jesus' side, that we are called to be like Jesus first, to keep our focus where he and God have kept their focus. We are called back to remember the truth of the Beatitudes, that blessed are the poor, the meek, the reviled, the ignored, and that we are called to not view them as others. We are called to not cherish what is cherished by society, riches and powers and influence, but we are called instead to make a better future. We are called to conserve what we need to bring about God's commonwealth here on earth and keep us progressing forward. And remembering that there's knowledge and there's wisdom, and to value wisdom even when we don't necessarily understand the knowledge. But all of this is a very heady conversation, and the story of the road to Emmaus makes an important point that even though Jesus was there, he was teaching these disciples, he was telling them what's going on, they still didn't recognize him. The story reminds us that it's not just in the learning that we find out what God is calling us to be and do, but it's in the living, it's in the walking, it's in the journey. It wasn't until they had reached Emmaus and Jesus acted like he was going to continue walking that the disciples asked him, indeed almost begged him to stay with them because it was getting dark. They remembered to practice the age-old truth of hospitality, of caring for the stranger. And so they invite him to stay with them, presumably in their home, perhaps it was an inn. And then in the midst of it all, they go to have a common meal together. And though usually it would be the role of the host, Jesus takes and serves the bread and the wine. And in this, they recognize him for who he is, the Messiah, the one that had just eaten with them a few days before. And then when they realized that he disappeared and they were so moved, they went back on the road and returned to Jerusalem to share their stories with the other disciples. And so hearing this story and looking for the rhythms and the echoes, we are asked and we are challenged to try to find the rhymes of Christ's story in this time of pandemic. Where do we see Jesus's love of neighbor and love of stranger being acted out? Now, one place that I've heard a lot of people bring up scripturally and also gets a little nod in today's scriptures is the story of Moses and the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Jesus started with the story of Moses because it's one of the most, if not the most important story in all of the Hebrew teachings. And I've heard many people now start making reference to the pandemic now as being some sort of parallel to the plagues that happened back then. Now, it's important though to realize that the point of the Exodus story wasn't even about the plagues. It was about God liberating God's people from oppression. What happened were simply tools or methods or ways in which God's people were freed. As it says in Exodus 7:5, the Egyptians will come to know that I am the Lord. And there's a lot of time that is spent in that story talking about the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, the softening, the rehardening. And so these plagues almost served as ways to demonstrate God's power and to soften Pharaoh's heart. But I find in these days, people that start focusing on looking at this pandemic as being some sort of biblical plague are missing the point, and they are focusing on the wrong thing. That it's not that God is causing the plagues to happen, it's that our truer and deeper selves are revealed in these times of crises. And for those that are worried about the costs of this pandemic and how it affects them and not others, they are subconsciously putting themselves not in the place of the Israelites, but in the Egyptians, in the people of power versus the ones that are acting out God's will. And so in the Exodus story, just as now, it's not just that there are bad things that are going on, it's that our human actions are exacerbating them, are making them worse, and it's revealing our true selves. I don't know about the rest of you, but this time that I've had to stay at home has really got me thinking more about history, both recent and historic history, longer history. I've heard a lot of talk in the news about the flu pandemic of 1917 and 1918 and how we can learn from that and use those models to what's going on now with COVID-19, which stands for the COVID virus that was released in 2019. But it wasn't until this week when I was talking with one of our regular attendees on the phone that I found out that there was actually another pandemic here in the United States, actually worldwide pandemic, in 1957 and 1958. I believe they called it the Hong Kong flu. Thankfully, we're not using such racist names for diseases anymore. But the person I was talking with was actually sent home from college because they had such a severe case of this disease. And a couple million people died from this. And so it offered a living memory, a living point to draw a comparison between then and now. And so I wonder, and I'm going to talk a little bit about where I see some of the rhymes in what's going on now with our earlier biblical stories and our earlier examples of diseases. And so I think the first thing to recognize is just like in the Exodus story, we're not just suffering from one pandemic or one plague. There's actually more that's going on right now. Of course, at the base, all of this is brought into the medical emergency of dealing with the novel coronavirus. But our own reactions to it, both globally, nationally, state by state, and community by community, is either making the disease more or less severe. And so I believe there are multiple plagues that are either going on now or that we're going to have to suffer through. And I'm not saying this as a way of saying that we're being punished, but just trying to look at what is coming next so we can prepare for it as best we can. The second plague that we'll have to deal with is one that we're already starting to see now, which is the economic suffering that's going on. Since March 14th, 26.5 million Americans have filed an initial claim for unemployment. That's almost 10% of our population. We aren't going to be able to predict what all is going on, um, nor am I trying to scare anyone or cause doom and gloom, but I am just speaking about the extent to which these challenges are going to force us to rethink how we live in our society. Because really, the third plague is even more disastrous, which is the same one that happened back in the time of Egypt, the hardening of our hearts. Because it happens again, it happens still. The plagues in Exodus were made worse by the response of Pharaoh. And in some cases, the COVID virus and the economic plague that we're dealing with now are being made worse through the choices of some of our leaders. Instead of pulling together as one country, 50 states are being left to fend for themselves for supplies, for tests, for information. Different states are organizing into smaller groups which are trying to pool their resources, but this does not substitute for a strong national coordinated response. And that has slowed our response to this disease in significant ways. Along the same lines of hardened hearts is we are dealing with the plague of division instead of unification. This lack of a national response is starting to fall on political lines and political rivalries, and there's just no place for this division in this time and in this place. This rejection of science because of our culture wars is something that is just not healthy and is not holy. The rejection of science for prejudice is not Christian at all. Now, there's a flip side to this as well, which is actually something I would say is more against our progressive branch, which is this narrative I'm hearing crop up more and more, wishing that people who don't take this virus seriously get sick. Wishing someone ill is not a Christian value. It's not any more valid because we call it Darwinism, like that somehow makes it okay, like it's a natural act of nature. Darwinism isn't science, and it's not Christian either. Survival of the fittest and loving our neighbor are polar opposites. None of us have gotten to where we are just by ourselves. We have been brought through our times of weakness and woe by the support of others, in our friends, in our families, in our communities, in our churches, in a variety of different ways. And we can't ever lose sight of that fact when we're in another time of struggle now. It's only by coming together do we protect ourselves. We're being encouraged to wear face masks now in public. And I'm not sure if I'd call this ironic, but the point is that us wearing a mask does not actually protect ourselves nearly as much as it protects other people from getting the disease if we have it and we don't know it. And so we are essentially wearing the mask for other people. We are scratching other people's backs so that they can also hopefully scratch ours. But it's not just about comfort, it's about mutuality and relying on one another. Now, there's one other place where I think that there have been some important notice of rhymes and patterns in this pandemic and dealing with an earlier pandemic. And it's one that doesn't get talked about much medically these days. It's the AIDS pandemic. And I'm sure medically it makes a lot of sense because the disease are spread such different ways. The COVID-19 virus is spread through aerosol particles. It flows through the air, whereas AIDS was only spread through exchange of bodily fluids. So medically, it might not make as much sense to draw comparisons to the AIDS epidemic as the flu pandemics of 1917 and 1957. But we do need to recognize that there are some societal and social parallels that are extremely important. The first one being Dr. Anthony Fauci, one of the primary medical experts on the national scene, actually came to prominence first in fighting the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s. And he has, throughout his time on the television and conversations, drawn a lot of similarities and parallels to the fore that I think are important. One thing that he said in April 7th was, when you're in the midst of a crisis like we are now with the coronavirus, it really does have ultimately shine a very bright light on some of the real weaknesses and foibles in our society. Now, he made these remarks during the White House's daily coronavirus task force briefing, and he was responding specifically to the disproportionate impact on Black Americans, and says it's shedding a light on health disparities in the US, much like HIV/AIDS did with the LGBTQ populations. He went on to say that during that time of the AIDS crisis, there was extraordinary stigma, particularly against the gay community. And it was only when the world realized how the gay community responded to this outbreak with incredible courage and dignity and strength and activism. He says, I think that it really changed some of the stigma against the gay community. Very much so. Now, I don't know what Dr. Fauci's political inclinations are or how he voted, and frankly, I don't care. But I do think in these statements that he is exemplifying the kind of conservative mindset that we need. Finding, keeping, treasuring, and lifting up the gifts from the past and the observations and carrying them forward now. That it's not just looking at the medical data from previous pandemics that is going to be important in informing how we respond, but our societal responses as well. Seeing both the limitations of our current society and seeing the greatness in other people stepping up and helping break down some of the walls that divide us. And so, in keeping all of this in mind, I think about how we have currently responded. And individually, I am very heartened by how our love for neighbor has been so strong. In every way, as individuals, as a community, as a church community, are limiting our contact with one another to keep people healthy, the sewing of face masks, the continued efforts on our social outreach programs, all of these are essential and important. And one reason the pandemic is not as bad as the medical models predicted is because people stayed home much more than was anticipated. And that is a blessing, a true blessing. Unfortunately, structurally, our love for neighbor is not universally as strong, and this has made the plagues and pandemics worse and longer lasting. As I mentioned before, over 24 million people are applying for unemployment, which has completely taxed the various unemployment systems in all of the states. I'm happy that our governor has quadrupled the number of people working on processing unemployment benefits, even as they're having to lay off other people. But still, we are struggling through all this, and it's going to take time. And we can't just wait for societal structures to take care of people. We have to keep looking out for our neighbors. We are still struggling with getting adequate testing, adequate supplies, adequate contact tracing, and this has been going on for months. And we are dealing with leadership that we can't always find to be reliable sources of factual and medically accurate information. And this is causing real danger in our world. And of course, this all leads to who suffers the most, the least of these. Partially because they are the least able to self-quarantine, partially because they are now the essential workers but don't have the supplies they need to stay healthy, and partially because it's revealing the deeper structural issues that are going on, the systemic injustices, the racial and economic stressors, the lack of adequate health care, and the passive social Darwinism that's been going on for so long in our country. And so, as we reflect back on this Easter time, as we reflect back on this scripture, on this road to Emmaus, we are also called to keep looking for the rhymes in history and how we are to keep God's focus as our focus and not just see what we want to see or hear what we want to hear. We remember that we see God better when we are doing what God has called us to do instead of just thinking about it. And we're reminded in this road to Emmaus story that even those disciples didn't recognize Jesus, even though they weren't sure about what's going on, because they stayed true to what they had learned and been taught and offered hospitality to a stranger, they were truly finally able to see the resurrected Christ. And I pray that we are able to do the same as well. Amen.